Hello, good evening, everyone. Good evening. I'm Yolanda Savage Narva. I use she, her pronouns, and I want to acknowledge that we are sitting on the ancestral tribal land of the Pamunkey people. As a member of the Board of Directors at Sixth and I, it is my sincere pleasure to welcome everyone here in person and the many tuning in virtually from around the country. Thank you so much for being with us tonight and for your support of a nonprofit. I'd also like to thank the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington and the Union for Reform Judaism for their support of tonight's program. It is such an honor to introduce our guest, Rabbi Angela Buchdahl, one of the most admired religious leaders in the world, to celebrate the release of her new book, Heart of a Stranger, an unlikely rabbi's story of faith, identity, and belonging. The daughter of a Korean Buddhist mother and a Jewish American father, Rabbi Buchdahl felt the first stirrings to become a rabbi when she was only 16. Despite the naysayers and periods of self-doubt, she stayed the course and became the first Asian American to be ordained as a rabbi in North America. Today, she is the senior rabbi of Central Synagogue in New York City and the first woman to lead the congregation in its 185th year history. Yes. Rabbi Buchdahl has even been a clue on Jeopardy! Talk about reaching the pinnacle of success. Heart of a Stranger beautifully captures her journey from outsider to officiant, and from feeling estranged to feeling embraced. It also serves as much-needed spiritual guide for everyday living, and we all need that now more than ever. Rabbi Buchdahl will be in conversation this evening with David Leonhardt, an editorial director for New York Times Opinion, and the author of Ours Was the Shining Future, the story of the American dream. And we have autographed copies for sale tonight. Thank you all again, both here and at home, for joining us. And please help give Rabbi Angela Buchdahl and David Leonhardt a warm welcome to Sixth and I.
Good evening, everyone.
Hello.
What a great crowd.
It's so nice to be here.
I know you think of yourself technically as a New York rabbi, but I can tell you from living in Washington, D.C., I hear all the time from people who sometimes stream Central Sermons. I see some of those people in the audience tonight. So if I may be so bold, welcome home to Washington, D.C.
Oh, thank you. Having grown up in Tacoma, Washington, when I would say I was from Washington, people always thought I was from here anyway, but it does feel like coming home because there are so many familiar faces here, and it's really wonderful to be here.
You say in the book that joy is so central to Jewish ritual that many rituals are simply known as simha, a joy. And this, for me, tonight is a simha. Because Angela and I have known each other basically since we were children. We met when we were 17 years old as slightly befuddled freshmen in college. We have known each other so long that we've known each other since I had hair, and since Angela had poofy hair.
Yes, permed hair.
As you will read in
pretty.
the book. And it is just, this is such a thrill for me because I, as a friend, have lived through many of the experiences that Angela describes in the book. And it is such a beautifully and bracingly honest book. I'm just so excited to talk
Oh,
with
thank you,
about
Dave.
it.
I just want to add that in addition to being one of my best friends since college and my husband's roommate, so he really knows intimately that chapter. um, you've remained one of my dear friends all the way through adulthood, and it's been such a gift. And I just want to name that as I was in Westport on my sabbatical in the middle of a pandemic and thinking to myself, can I possibly write a book? Dave and his family stayed with us. We were a little quarantine pod for a few days, and we had a couple of book talks that really helped me feel like I could, because Dave had done this before. So
Well, thank you. You could and you did.
Thank you.
Let's start by talking about your parents. And just to give people kind of a tour of the conversation, we're going to talk about Angela's book. I'm going to give you a flavor of it in a bunch of ways. Angela's going to give you a flavor of it. And then I have questions that several of you, more than several, submitted in advance. And we'll get to as many of those as we can toward the end. Let's start with your parents. Fred and Solja, they are the heroes of the book in many ways.
Yeah.
And this is a book about boundary crossing, to use your phrase. Can you just give us a sense for how profound the set of barriers that they crossed were? And I actually want to ask you to start with your dad, because in some ways the boundaries that he crossed are less obvious, but they were also profound.
My parents definitely are the heroes of this book, and I dedicated it to them. And you're lucky because you're the only outside of New York group that has them here. They're right here in the second row, my parents. So, and I think truly one of the greatest thrills of my life is to share their story. When you write a memoir, you don't write just your own story. You end up writing the story of your family, sometimes your friends, your mentors, and in my case, my congregation as well, and the Jewish people. But it's been one of the greatest thrills is for them to have gotten the love that that they deserve, and seeing what it's been like for my life here, which is across the country from where they live, which is still Tacoma. And so thank you for giving them such a nice welcome. So my father grew up, he was already the third generation Jewish family in Tacoma, Washington. And you might think, how did Jews get to Tacoma? They were woodworkers, and I guess Pacific Northwest just had a lot of trees. And so they ended up going way west and started a millworking company in 1906, I believe. Puget Sound Manufacturing. They made doors and fireplaces. And my dad grew up in the generation where his parents in particular, they only socialized with other Jews. And there were only about 200, 300 Jewish families in Tacoma. And at some point they realized they couldn't sustain two synagogues, so they merged into one. So it was a one synagogue town, and for 30 miles it was the only Jewish thing going. And I think it was a big deal that my father left Washington State, not like his brothers, to go to college, and then even a bigger deal that he was in ROTC and got placed in South Korea. And for him to marry my mother I just want to give you some context of the fact that this was the 1960s, and there were states in America in which my father's marriage to my Korean mother would have been illegal. Loving versus Virginia didn't get passed until 1967, and they were married a few months after it was passed. So that was a big boundary crossing for them for him to go to that country. He ended up living there for 10 years, and for him to meet my mother. There were probably others as well. And my mother, her boundary crossing journey, I have to go back at least one more generation, which is that in the 1920s, Japan occupied Korea, and my grandmother, when she was only 5 years old, was forcibly brought with her parents to Japan. So she grew up in Japan as a Korean woman, which was definitely a second-class status, and did one of the few things you could do, which was to run a boarding house. If you all read Pachinko, I read Pachinko, and I was like, oh my God, that's my grandmother's life. She's running a boarding house as a Korean in Japan. During that time, there were resistance fighters who were trying to get Korea freed from Japanese occupation, and my grandfather was one of these very romantic resistance fighters who was literate, so he would run messages back and forth between Japan and Korea. And he happened to stay at a boarding house and met my grandmother. So they met, got married, and apparently he kept going back and forth, and every time he ended up back in Korea, she got pregnant and had another baby. They had 9 pregnancies. Yeah. My mother was right in the middle of the batch, and she was born in Japan. And at that time, as a Korean born in Japan, you couldn't have a Korean name. So she was named Yukiko, which is not what my mother is called today, and wasn't allowed to speak Korean in the house. You had to speak Japanese in that country. So it was a big boundary crossing. When the war was over, World War II, they had to go back home. But interestingly, they were in some ways seen as foreigners in their own homeland when they came back, because my grandmother spoke Korean with a Japanese accent. And then my mother met my father. That was a big boundary crossing. And she ended up, moving to America, and that was her own boundary crossing. Of course, boundary crossings are not just physical and geographic, but there were many of these journeys along the way.
Can I ask you to read a paragraph
Yeah.
from the book? So the one right here, the last paragraph on page 2.
Okay. My Jewish American father traveled far from home and met my Korean Buddhist mother in Seoul. Despite vast differences, they fell in love and married in 1968 after Loving versus Virginia made interracial marriage legal in every state. I was born in 1972, the same year that Sally Presand, the very first female rabbi in America, was ordained, following solely male leadership. That same year, Congress enacted Title IX, forcing schools across the country to increase equity for women. Yale, which was my alma mater, had only just achieved gender parity a few years before I arrived on campus. And I immigrated to America in the mid-1970s, just as the Reform movement, a quintessentially American brand of liberal Judaism, changed its attitudes and policies towards interfaith families like mine, from outright rejection to outreach and inclusion. It's not an exaggeration to say that had I been born even a decade earlier, my very existence as a female American Reform rabbi would not have been possible.
It's amazing. And it's a testament to the power of social and political change as well.
Absolutely.
Right? Because those things didn't just happen. They happened because people started movements and made sure they happened. And the benefits, the legacy of those changes extend for forever, for generations.
I think I'm so glad you pointed that out, and I'm embarrassed to say that I didn't fully put all of that together until I was writing this book.
Yeah.
And it's kind of crazy. I mean, I got to Yale, and I was so naive. As I said, Yale had only reached gender parity because they were forced to. When they started admitting women in 1969, they were convinced that they should only admit 1 woman for every 7 men. And they were really only admitting women, they said, because they couldn't attract the best men anymore if they didn't have women. So we were basically an accessory to attract the best male students. So this is not a small thing that social change was forced upon a school that wasn't ready to do it. And I arrived on campus when it had barely gotten to be 50-50 men and women. And I was sort of like, why do we even need a women's center anymore? Like, feminism has done its job. I can't believe how naive I was. And I think that we forget those impacts. I didn't really register Loving versus Virginia until decades later, and then I didn't even realize the Title IX coincidence of my birth the same year as Title IX. I did know that the first female rabbi was ordained the year that I was born, but you don't even think about those things because you just are in your reality and have a very short memory when you're young.
I realize this is not the biggest benefit, but as a male alumnus of Yale, who, like you, is married to a classmate, I'm very glad the ratio changed from 1 to 7, because you guys would have had many more choices. You could have picked someone else. One thing that really struck me, things struck me about both your parents while reading the book, and I've known them a long time. I loved the sense of unconditional confidence and support that your dad has in you. And this sense that when you doubted yourself, you would call him and you would say, am I really Jewish? And there's that great quote, right? He says, you're 100% Jewish, 100% Korean, and 100% American. And it reminded me a little bit of my dad as well, which is, this question is not about that. But can you just reflect on what that support and confidence gave you, and also how it affected your own parenting?
I mean, I think I had such an amazing balance between my parents. My father, definitely, just just the most, I had unconditional love from both my parents, but my dad was the most affirming person. And I remember, I don't know, I was 16 and heartbroken over some boy who didn't like me, and he was like, someday someone is going to be very lucky. And I remember that on the one hand I was like, oh, Dad, of course you have to say that. And it also was just so wonderful to feel that sense of like such strength of not just love but belief in me. And it was backed up with a lot of like sitting at the piano bench with me to practice every day when I was younger. And then when I got serious about flute, and the best flute teacher was in Seattle, my dad literally drove me an hour to Seattle every week for that flute lesson and showed up at every swim meet. And it was not just support, it was presence. And my mother, it was a little less the Korean style to be like, oh yes, everything is great. But my mother had the gift of, it wasn't always affirmation of like, oh yes, you can do it, or oh yes, you're Jewish. Her way of helping me gain confidence was by asking me the right question that helped me find my own answer in that way. And so I think between the two of them, the love was always there and I never questioned it. But I think between both the affirmation and the questions, it helped me. And I think what's interesting is I had a little bit of a tough love Korean mother, and I became the total softie when I became a parent, and now my kids are perfect and I can never say they do anything wrong. My husband, however, grew up with a mom who, her mantra was like, you never say no to a child. And I was like, who does that? And he became kind of the disciplinarian in the house, so it is funny how we both, want to take on and react to our models.
One thing that's striking to me about your mom is the extent to which she was a leader in her community. Mm-hmm. She helped build a community. And obviously, that is now what you do. And one of the striking things about the book is you say you actually had not realized the extent of your mother's leadership role in your community until you were older.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So my mother, comes as an immigrant at age 35 to America, and I think it was very lonely. She says that it was very lonely for her. She had me and my sister and my father, and we did have relatives, but it just didn't feel like home. And we left what was like a warm bath of like a multi-generational house where my grandmother lived with us, and we had all of my aunties living nearby and like 15 cousins. And so that to go to this felt very hard. And my mother found comfort and community with a small group of women who started, like 20 of them, who met in a living room and they called themselves the Korean Women's Association. And they really just wanted to get together and eat Korean food and sing songs and remember their homeland together. But as things came up with this community, and the first thing that started to come up is one of them talked about the fact that she was a victim of domestic violence and she had nowhere to turn and her language skills weren't really enough. And my mom thought, oh my gosh, we have to start a domestic violence shelter, because the more they dug, they realized this was not the only person. And then the next thing they knew, they were also looking at their elderly in their community who needed home health aides who could cook the foods that they would eat and speak their language. So she started actually a home health care service. Once she was in relationship with these elderly folks, she started realizing that they needed affordable housing and applied for HUD grants to build affordable housing. When I was a kid, all I thought my mom did was like make me come to these elderly meals and have to ladle out rice. And I was like, oh, I have to go to the KWA to do rice dinner again for 300 people. And it wasn't until I came back, and 30 years later, they were celebrating my mom at the anniversary of KWA, and they announced that KWA now was the second largest social service organization in all of Washington State. It employed 1,500 people and worked in every county. They had built over 200 units of affordable housing for elderly in the community, served way beyond the Korean community to serve people of all kinds. She also was an English as a second language teacher. That was her day job. She taught in the public schools for 30 years. And in addition to that, she founded the first Korean language program in any public school in America. And she taught that class. And now there are over 200 public schools that teach Korean. but she taught the first one and helped get the Korean SAT started. So it's like my mom is a wonder. And you know, in this weird way that I'm embarrassed to say, when you're a kid, you're like, she's just your mom, and you don't see her as like a real person almost. And she's just, you know, I was always a little bit in awe of my mom, but I didn't fully appreciate what she built until I was much older. And I will say one thing, because I think that I ended up in a different path, but in some ways it's very similar, that I think my mother did so much of this, both because she felt this deep desire to serve and if she could get something done, she wanted to get it done. But I also think that when you are someone who feels like a foreigner, when you can welcome in the next batch of kids and teach them English and help them feel like they're Americans, when you can bring in her 3 sisters, as she did, and they came through our home, and then she helped settle them in Tacoma, and when you do all of this welcome, that's what makes you feel a greater sense of belonging. I mean, when she welcomed my emo 2 years after we arrived, suddenly she was the American. And so you realize that sense of welcome and hospitality that she did basically her entire life, and creation of the home that she wanted to build so that she could feel belonging, is in many ways what I do as a rabbi as well.
Yeah. So now we'll come more to you. So you described the atmosphere for your mom in Korea as being like a warm bath. In some ways, that's what your Jewish community in Tacoma was like.
Yes, that's true.
For you. I mean, you were, I assume the synagogue where I attended your wedding was the same one
Yes,
where your
that's where I
dad
grew up.
was bar mitzvah.
Yeah, not the physical building, but the synagogue.
Community.
Yeah, the community.
The community. And so one of the things that's so striking, given what follows, is you talk about the idea that in Tacoma, in your high school, in many settings, when people thought about Judaism, they thought of you.
Right.
You were the representative.
I was the face
of
of Jews. They thought Jews looked like me and my sister, because we were 2 of the 3 in the Jews in the high school. Yeah, it is a funny thing. You know, if some of you, I imagine, grew up as Jews in small towns or like small Jewish communities, and there were only 3 Jews in my high school, and because I also was like very involved in my school and student body president and all those things, I was frequently called upon to be kind of the Jew, the representative, and that meant things like, you know, oh, now Angela's going to light the menorah at our Christmas assembly, and that was really like what I had to do. I had to walk over and light the menorah, and it was like and I felt proud. I was representing Judaism. And when you grow up in a small town and there are almost no Jews, you feel like if I'm not carrying Judaism, no one will. And so that actually made me feel even more empowered in a way as a Jew. So imagine my surprise when I ended up on the Bronfman Youth Fellowship, which is a wonderful selective program to go to Israel, a fellowship with 25 Jews from all denominations in Israel for a 5-week study program. And it was really the first time that I met Jews who, let's just start by saying, they seemed way more Jewish than I was. Like, you know, it's not about what they looked like. It was about the fact that they grew up in communities where everyone in their neighborhood was Jewish, where they had whole aisles of kosher for Passover food. I couldn't believe that like places like this existed, and they were fluent in Hebrew, and they went to Jewish day school, and they already had studied Talmud, and my roommate on Bronfman, she actually knit kippot, which is like as a hobby, and I thought to myself, I was like, that's a Jewish life, and I was like, and then on top of the kind of internal struggle that I was having about whether or not I was Jewish enough, because you know, I'll be honest, on Friday nights I was playing piccolo in the marching band at our football games, and I thought like, well, if that's what I'm doing, and look at her life, it's so wholly Jewish, then maybe I'm not really fully Jewish. And then add to that my not Jewish looking face, and then add to that the fact that for the first time, I had more traditional Jews say, you do realize that the halachic, which is the Jewish legal definition of Jewish status, is traced through the mother's line. It's matrilineal descent. And you don't have a Jewish mother, so you're not a Jew. And imagine that you feel like you've been carrying Judaism for your whole community, and you were already the president of your youth group, and you were already song leading in your synagogue, and you were doing all of these things, and you felt that this was who you were at your core. And all of that, both the internal and the external challenges, it all felt like it was being pulled out from underneath me. And add to the fact that like 16-year-olds in general will just also have so much angst about their identity and who they are. And that's a time when you want to question and say, who am I? And so I would say that set off a Jewish identity crisis that lasted for many years all the way through college.
I want to get more into that, but first of all, I love the idea. So you and your sister Gina are growing up in Tacoma as two of the only Jewish kids in the community. So people there think that Jews might happen to look Asian. Yeah. And meanwhile, across the country in Georgia, Vermont, Jacob Buchdahl, your future husband, and his sister Sarah are growing up in the town where they're the only Jews.
The only Jews. They grew up in a rural town in Vermont with like more cows than people. 1,500 people, more cows, and only one Jewish family.
And Jacob is 6'2" and blonde.
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
And so the people in Vermont thinking, this is what Jews are like. So you have this experience, and you ultimately decide, after really agonizing over the decision, to convert. And you and I were friends back then. I can tell you, Angela did agonize over this decision. I mean, it is as much internal tension as I've ever seen you have over anything. It is so difficult to think about the idea that you're going to convert to something that you already are. To what extent did you do that defensively? To what extent did you do that? I'll use a Washington reference. Remember Obama at his first inauguration, Roberts kind of flubbed the oath of office? People here may remember that. And Obama said, this is stupid. They're going to say I didn't really do it. So the next day they redid the oath of office. He just wanted to take it off the table. To what extent was your decision to convert just something where you said, you know what? I don't ever want to deal with someone saying I'm not Jewish, so I'm going to do it. And to what extent was it really for you?
It's a great question. When I was first confronted with the idea that I might not have the status of a Jew for many Jews in America and Jews in Israel for that matter. One of my friends on my Bronfman trip suggested, I think she meant very helpfully, don't worry, Angela, you can always convert. And I know she meant that as like, you can be just as Jewish as us, but that was very offensive. I was like, and the idea that I would convert to something that had been the only thing I thought I was my whole life was so, I immediately felt very defensive about it. And maybe I considered it for a little bit, but by the end of the summer, I was like, I have Jewish memory. I have Jewish in me, in my kishkas. I know that this is who I am, and I'm not going to convert for anybody else. And I actually, maybe this tells you a little bit about my personality. I was like, and that's also when I decided I'm going to be a rabbi. It wasn't to spite anyone or prove anyone, but maybe a little bit. But anyway, I was absolutely resistant to the idea of conversion, and I was for many, many years. But my stirring and my questioning and my actually not really thinking that I was Jewish enough was very, very prominent in my mind. And it was so painful. I literally remember a time where I was thinking about this. I was driving my car, and I started crying so hard that I literally had to pull over to the side of the road. It's just that's how painful it is to feel like you are invisible as who you believe yourself to be. And I know that people who have identity issues in lots of ways can feel that existential pain. But what I would say happened over the many years is, first of all, I became more and more comfortable in my, on the one hand with what I was learning and knowing, and on the other hand, I was being more and more questioned by people within my community of how Jewish I was. I had a breaking point, which I don't know if we're going to ask me this question or not, so maybe I'll go into it. I'll tell the story, which is just that I was back in Israel. This was now my third trip to Israel. I was 20 years old. I was doing research for my senior thesis, and I was living with friends from college that knew me well, and one of them had become much more observant, and she, even though she knew how I was as a Jew and admired that in some way, she also was like, Angela, the Jewish music you do, it's not like Jewish music. It's like James Taylor with Hebrew words to it. Which was not wrong. And
also sounds kind of enjoyable.
Yeah, it was, listen, Jews have always borrowed the best melodies and put Hebrew words to it. And like, that's how we made Jewish music. I mean, there's always been the syncretism of that. But I think that what was very painful is someone who knew me had now sort of said, you're not Jewish enough. And I had a kind of a painful episode with her about kashrut. It's in the book. You'll have to read it. And then I also had a woman who I really wanted to interview for my thesis, who once she figured out that I had a Korean mother, she said to me, I can only teach Torah to Jews. And so I'm sorry I can't do this interview. By the way, that's like the least Jewish thing you could say. By the way, you can teach Torah to anyone, but also it was very painful. And then I had this whole episode with the women at the wall, which I describe much more in detail here, but I'll just say that it ended with my devising that my test to show that I belonged with the group and that I was actually Jewish was that I asked for an aliyah when the women of the wall, this was back in 1993 when nobody knew who women of the wall were except for Jackie Ellenson, who was a prominent rabbi who brought me along to join her. And as soon as I got up there to chant the blessing before Torah, which I had probably chanted 5,000 times before. Of course, I screwed it up right in that moment. And I can't describe, because it sounds like, oh, of course, it's just a mistake in Hebrew. No, because I had set this up and because I had had so many moments where I felt like I'm not enough, that moment was like the failure of the test. And I proved that I didn't belong. And by the way, of course, all the women corrected me immediately as soon as I messed up the words. And I just felt like it was like a slap from all of them. And I know that's not the way they intended it, but that's how it felt. And I came home and I called my mother, and it was like midnight for her. And that was when you had to pay every minute of long distance. It was very expensive from Israel. And I cried for probably 5 very expensive long distance minutes before I could even get the words out, where I was like, I keep wanting to do this and I just feel rejection at every turn. And I remember that I felt like I still wanted to be a rabbi, but I wasn't sure I could be a Jew anymore. And I said, that's it, Mom, I'm done. I could just stop being a Jew right now. I don't have a Jewish name. I don't have a Jewish face. No one would even know, and I could stop being a Jew. And my mother, this is where she's very good with the questions, instead of saying like, no, don't worry, you're Jewish enough, which I would have dismissed. She said, is that really possible? And it wasn't until she asked that question, and I really thought that I could completely shed being a Jew, and then had to really think about it. It was like I had fallen off a cliff and hit rock bottom, but when you hit rock bottom, it's a form of landing. And I landed. It's like I stopped falling. And somehow I picked myself up and brushed myself off, and I was like, well, I'm still a Jew. And I realized that it was as bone deep as my being Korean and as bone deep as my being the woman that I was and being Angela. And I couldn't stop being a Jew even if I wanted to, even if people never recognized that I was. That's who I was. And that was the moment that I suddenly felt like something shifted in me where I didn't feel the incredible turmoil anymore. And then the nail in the coffin of like why I ultimately ended up doing what I called a conversion, which was really a giur in Hebrew, was talking with a rabbi, Elliot Dorff, about conversion. And he said, Angela, conversion in the Western sense, we think of it as like a complete turning around. And that's why I think you're rejecting that idea, because you've always been a Jew. He said, but in Judaism, we think of giur as someone reaffirming the Jewish soul that has always been in them. And when he said that, I was like, well, that's me. That resonates. I'm gonna affirm that I've always been a Jew, and I'm choosing it in a way. And in many ways, I realize today in America, we're all Jews by choice. We all decide if we're really going to be doing this and a part of this and inserting ourselves in the larger Jewish story. And I found that it was not, I did a Beit Din, which is a rabbinic court, and I went to a mikveh in Seattle, and I did it with my home rabbi and 2 other Reform rabbis, which I knew would mean that for Orthodox Jews, that wasn't going to be a kosher enough conversion. But I didn't do it for them. I didn't do it for kind of acknowledgement necessarily externally. It was a way of ritualizing a kind of journey that I'd been on for the last 5 years in which I recognize and affirm that I'm a Jew.
It also, I'm going to come back to this idea later, but it reminds me of this lovely line you have in the book. Feeling like a stranger might be the most Jewish thing about me, right? That this idea of feeling other actually is endemic to Judaism.
Yes.
Can I ask you to reflect and maybe offer a little bit of tough love to the Jewish community today about the ways in which you think we are now not sufficiently open? So I think we all can look back on some of the stories that you told and laugh in a slightly superior way, right? Like, we wouldn't do that now. But the truth almost certainly has to be that there are still ways in which we are doing that. Maybe there are still some of the same ways that you experience. Maybe there are different ways that we don't notice. And so what advice would you have for Jewish communities around the country about ways in which they could be more welcoming and more opening and try to avoid experiences for the younger versions of you and your sister and your family?
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to first acknowledge that I think we've come a long way from what it was like when I was growing up in the 70s. That was both about how our community has changed and also how our community has embraced in a different way. But I still think that we have a ways to go. I was named Rabbi at Central now already 13 years ago. I've been at Central for 20 years. And you know how you think, well, if they named an Asian rabbi to be the senior rabbi, then we've really come a long way. And in a certain way, we obviously have. But it was interesting that when George Floyd was murdered in 2020, and I think our country went through kind of a reckoning around race, I started to hear from Jews of color in my own congregation, and I thought that we had already gotten way beyond this. And Robert, who is an African-American who comes to services every single week, he said, you know, I have never written to you about this, but you know, the first few times that I came to Central, you know, the security guard, he trailed me all the way in and stayed by suspiciously. And he said, I almost didn't come back after that. That's not the way you treat your other members of the community. And he said, even though I've been here almost every single week, and Central's a big place, not everyone knows everyone, he says, inevitably someone will come up and say, where are you from? And that's not a bad question. It's a well-meaning question oftentimes. Or, you know, what neighborhood are you from? Or, are you Jewish? Where, you know, who did you come with? Now, many of these questions sound very innocuous, but I want you to imagine that every time you walk into a synagogue or any Jewish space, I want you to imagine being asked that over and over again. Do you know what that basically messages? You don't really belong here. You look like you're an outsider. And I think that I use this analogy, but like if Robert had walked into a fancy department store and the security guard had trailed behind him and then said, hey, what are you doing here? We would just say that's racism. But we don't think for a moment that that's somehow unusual to kind of treat someone like that who walks into a synagogue space. So I realized after I had this conversation with Robert, I was like, it's like imagining that because we elected our first black president that we don't have racism in America. I was like, okay, we can have a Korean rabbi, but we still have a problem at Central Synagogue. And I realized that it wasn't just a conversation I needed to have about race writ large in the nation. I needed to talk about some of the issues in our own community that were still prevalent. So it goes beyond sort of simple things of like, do you look Jewish? Of course, I got that joke all the time, which wasn't that funny when I was little. That's funny, you don't look Jewish. That was just a given. You know, people don't say that so much anymore, thank God. But I would say that there's something else that's a little bit different, which is this presumption that Judaism, that there's a kind of way of looking and being Jewish that is this ephemeral thing that feels akin to race. Or, you've heard that word like a Judar. Like, oh, I'll tell you one story that I told in a sermon about race where there was an interfaith couple. They were actually both white. And one was interested in conversion. She grew up from Texas, going to Protestant church every single Sunday. But she was interested in Judaism. And she said to her husband, who wanted her to convert, so tell me what matters to you in Judaism? What is it about for you? And he said, well, Judaism, it's like my culture. It's like how I feel. It's like that great feeling that when I walk into a room and I can just pick out the Jews in the room. and I looked at her and I was like, you mean like you're a rabbi? And it was a very subtle thing because of course he didn't want to make it feel like it was an exclusive club you had to be born into. But she said, if your Judaism is just about a culture or this kind of vague cultural feeling or Judar, she's like, then I can convert, but I'll never be that. I'm a Texas girl who grew up without that kind of cultural Judaism, and that's never going to be who I am. So there has to be more substance to what it is to be a Jew. I don't want to dismiss the Jewish culture piece. It's fantastic. I love it. It just can't be the only thing. And there has to be ways that can look different. Because, by the way, if you've ever been around a bunch of Sephardi Jews, they have a very different culture. And when I gave this sermon about race, I just want to tell you, I got some pushback from people because there's a way that I get it. It feels like there's a comfort in knowing that your Judaism is kind of like in your DNA. Like people came up and said, but I took my 23andMe and I'm 99.9% Ashkenazi DNA. That's a race. And I said, no, that means you're from the same part of Europe as a bunch of other Jews from that part of Europe. If you were to take the DNA of Iraqi Jews who've been Jews for 2,000 years, they would have different DNA. It doesn't mean that they're less Jewish or more Jewish. And by the way, does that mean that I'm less Jewish because I have 50% Korean, Mongol DNA? And so I think that it is the idea of Judaism as a race is a dangerous idea. And unless you want to get into this, the whole idea of race is a construct that has been created to create hierarchies of human value. And it has always been used by our enemies against us. So why would Jews want to actually turn that and use that as our definition for ourselves? So this is the main message I want to say, is that let's think about different definitions of what it means to actually be Jewish that are not about us being a race. Let's talk about us being a family. Let's talk about being a people. Let's talk about being a joyful religion. Let's talk about being a wisdom tradition. There's so much we could talk about that. And when we talk about it that way, my guess is we talk about the substance of it, and people will want to be a part of it, and they will feel like they actually could be if they wanted to. Thank you.
So much of this book is about religious practice. You mentioned before that our family spent a couple weekends together, podded together during the pandemic, which I think is just an excuse to actually see other people during the pandemic that we called a pod. And you talked a lot about the book. And I will make a confession, which is you said you were going to intersperse the story of your life with sermons in the book.
Yes.
I didn't tell you this at the time, but I thought your publisher is not going to let you do that. Your
That's
publisher
amazing.
did let you do it, and they're my favorite parts of the book. I mean, I have many favorite parts, but they're wonderful. And one of the things that really struck me about the theme, or a theme that emerged, and I say this so you can correct me if you think it's wrong or expand on it. I thought there were multiple parts of those sermons where you essentially talked about the importance of carving out a space that is a little bit separate from daily life and from modern life. So you do it when you tell the wonderful story about Rose, your daughter, and you'll correct my Hebrew pronunciation, but Tisomet Lev. You do it when you talk about the importance of these deep friendships, Chaver Ma'ala, and you do it in your section about marriage, where you talk about Kiddushin. And so I want to ask you to talk about this idea, particularly when we're all separated by our phones,
Yeah.
of needing to carve out space. And I have to tell you a story, which is one of Angela's blurbers is Senator Cory Booker. And I was recently interviewing Senator Booker, and I told him that we would be doing this. And he asked me to tell this story on stage, which is he recently got engaged.
Yes, he did. I was so happy for him.
Not only did he get engaged, but he got engaged to a Jewish woman who will experience some of the same questions, unfortunately, that you suggested, which is, which one of your parents is Jewish? And after they got engaged and he wanted to convey to her what his vision of marriage was, he read her your sermon on Kiddushin, on marriage.
Oh my God, I'm so touched.
And can you talk a little bit about this idea of marriage and why that relates to the Kiddush Cup, and then more generally about, in the world that we find ourselves living in, why you have to build tight communities and separate spaces in order to live a meaningful Jewish life?
Okay. I love that question, and so touched by that story. So marriage in Hebrew is called kiddushin. It has the same root, if you're Jewish, as many words that you probably know, like kaddish or kiddush or kadosh. All of those at its root mean holiness in one way or another, or sanctification. So marriage is sanctification, holiness. Okay, so that sounds very highfalutin. And when I'm meeting with couples and I say to them, your marriage is called kiddushin, which means your holiness, but in Hebrew, the root for kadosh, for holiness, is very simple. It literally means set apart. Okay, that sounds very simple, but also it's very hard. If you want to make your marriage holy, you have to set apart this relationship from all other relationships in one way or another. So I explain, we share, if you are in a marriage, it's probably the way that you make your marriage holy is there probably some emotional parts of your life or your heart that is set apart only for that other person, and some physical intimacies that might be reserved just, I hope, for that other person. And when it's not, that somehow the sacredness is taken away. And I use this analogy because, and I said it's not just a one-time thing. It's not like a rabbi makes a marriage holy. You have to do it, and you have to do it not just the day that you get married, but it is actually a continual act of setting this relationship apart. And I gave the example, I asked them, do you know what makes a Kiddush cup a Kiddush cup? And I said, and sometimes couples will answer, they'll say, it's made out of silver, or it's got Hebrew letters on it, or you buy it in Israel and it's blessed by a rabbi. No, those are not the answers. A Kiddush cup can be made out of anything. It doesn't have to be made in Israel. It doesn't have to have Hebrew letters on it. You could have like a very simple tin cup, and it could be a Kiddush cup. The thing that makes it a Kiddush cup is that you set it aside and only use it on sacred occasions. That's it. That's it. If you only use it on Shabbat and holidays, it becomes a Kiddush cup. If you buy, by the way, one of those very fancy Kiddush cups with gemstones in Israel and you use it every day, it stops being a Kiddush cup, right? So because you haven't set it apart. And you can imbue holiness in almost anything you want. My mother-in-law has a tablecloth made out of linen with little spring flowers. It was given to her by her mother-in-law, and she only uses it for Passover. And when she pulls it out, that's a sacred tablecloth. And she only uses it for that occasion. And that's part of what makes it sacred. So imagine the things that you think of as sacred in your life, and imagine that marriage is sacred. And the way you make it sacred is not because a rabbi blesses it or some sprinkle of fairy dust gets on it. It's holy because you've said, I have taken the intentionality of setting this apart from everything else. We can make time in Judaism holy. So imagine that when we say about Shabbat, take the Sabbath day, set it apart, and make it holy. It's not holy just because it's Friday night. It's holy because you've actually decided you're going to have a different kind of special meal. You're going to put out the special plates and the beautiful candles, and you're going to actually sit down as a family, and maybe you're going to unplug from your phones. If you don't do any of that, it's not going to be holy. It's not going to be Shabbat. I mean, it will be for some people, but maybe not for you. And I think about imagining that you could live a life of a little bit more holiness by being more intentional. And the the story I tell of my daughter is that my daughter's my third child, and she has very attention-grabbing, garrulous older brothers who, like at the dinner table in particular, always took up all the energy. So my daughter somehow had a habit when she was little that when she wanted to say something important to me, she would literally grab both of my cheeks with her hands and hold my face when she talked to me. She was like, she needed me to have the full attention. And I was thinking about the fact that how rare it is that we give something our full and complete attention. In fact, we actually think that multitasking is a virtue, and monotasking is somehow inefficient or a waste of time, or I don't know what it is. So the word for attention in Hebrew is so beautiful. So every sermon in this book, every chapter has a mini Devar Torah, a little mini sermon, and it's centered around one Hebrew word or Hebrew concept. So in this chapter, tisomet lev is the word for attention in Hebrew. And that word lev might be familiar, it means heart. So tisomet lev is where you sim, where do you put your heart? So attention literally means where do you put your heart? So I was thinking about that with my daughter, who was asking me for my attention. And our lives at the end of the day will be a sum of what we have given our attention to. So when you're thinking about how you want to spend your life and your attention, think about where you are putting your heart.
And you had a nice, gentle mention of phones there. But I'll hammer it harder, which is when you're looking at your phone, you're not paying attention to the people in your life. You're just not. Yeah. Okay, before I get to questions for everyone else, let's talk a little bit about politics. I know. But it is one of the most difficult things for people in positions of leadership today, like you, how to balance how much you let politics in and how much you keep it out. You quote a rabbi in the book who talks about a house of worship should be a house with windows, correct?
Yes, it's from the Talmud, a line from the Talmud. A person should always pray in a house that has windows.
It's really hard to get that balance right, right? Because if you close off the things that are on so many people's minds, it feels disconnected from the world. And if you open them up too much, everyone just starts screaming at each other the same way they do on text chains and on social media.
Yeah.
How do you think about this balance of, in this incredibly polarized time, what is the right amount of light to let in through those windows? How do you think about the idea that there might be some things that are so important that you want to take some kind of position on them? And yet when you do, you are guaranteed to alienate some number of people who it is your job to look out for.
Central is a wildly diverse congregation, and I mean that in almost any vector you could think of, from geography, and we have about 30 neighbors who are part of our online virtual community, which I just want to give them a shout out because I'm so happy they're here. And and our neighbors are part of our virtual community. We actually, 15% of our membership don't actually have a home address in New York. So that's just to give you 1 out of 7. So that's kind of crazy too. So we are diverse, but maybe the place that this matters most is we are politically diverse, ideologically diverse, and have the full range on Israel, for example. And so, and I just want to start by saying I'm deeply proud to lead a community that has that diversity. I think it's actually a sacred responsibility to hold diverse communities together. And I think that they are increasingly rare spaces. It's not always comfortable. I will tell you right now, it is really, really hard. And it has been also through these last 2 years of the war in Israel. And it's not always comfortable. But I will tell you that I think it keeps me much more intellectually honest. I think that when we are in a monoculture, we just veer more and more into the extremes because we get fed in that. And I also think that it is really, really important to be able to see people who you vote very differently from and think very differently from, but maybe you can still sit next to them and sing together in services. Or maybe on Wednesday mornings you can come and serve meals to the homeless. And you don't have to necessarily agree on everything, but you will not be able to demonize that person in the same way if you've served a meal together. And you are reminded that there is something bigger that you are serving together, and there's a certain common humanity. And so what I would say is that, do I talk about politics? Rarely and very carefully, but I do, because there are times when it just feels that you cannot stay silent on issues, and because they are part of our Jewish lives, and so I must speak on them. But when I think about how I do it, I take a lesson from a page book from the pairs of the Talmud, the zugot of teachers who would always be at least two schools of thought in the rabbinic era, and like Hillel and Shammai were the most famous of them. And they were pretty much always in disagreement about everything. And in fact, there was a story about that they disagreed so much for 3 years on one issue that they didn't even want their children to intermarry. It's kind of like the way now I hear people say, oh my God, my son is dating a Republican. And, and it's like, that's much worse than intermarrying, okay? So, marrying the opposite politics. But this is where Hillel and Shammai were. They didn't want their children to marry from someone from the other school because they really disagreed. And ultimately, a bat kol, a voice from heaven, comes down and says, these and these, when you are having an argument for the sake of heaven, these and these can be the words of the living God. Meaning you can hold kind of truths that seem like they're in opposition. Jews have understood that and taught that. And then, at the same time, there's a reason that all those campus groups are called Hillel and not called Shammai. Because Hillel, 90% of the time, the ruling would go with Hillel. And why? Why was Hillel always the one who kind of got his way? Well, the rabbis say it's because he would always articulate the minority position before he even argued his own. So when I do talk about a political position, one of the things that I really try to do, and this is not just a device, this I think is just important, is I really try to understand and give the most respectful articulation of the side that I disagree with. And I think when I do that, first of all, it makes me think harder about the position that I feel like, and sometimes it shifts me. But I also think that even then when people don't agree with where I am, they feel like, all right, she at least considered where I'm coming from, and she was thoughtful about it, and she's not just dismissing my fears or the worries or the things I'm thinking about. And so I think we could do a lot more of that. And I think also I feel very lucky that I love and respect my community. So when people think these things, I think if we start from a place of benefit of the doubt, that I'm trusting that people are coming from a good place and I'm trying to understand why they feel that, or if I don't understand it, like to understand the fear or the worry that's causing that idea. I think if we could do a little bit more of that, we could demonize each other less.
I think so often I hear people say, they mean it well, but I'm not sure they always reflect on what it says, which is they lament how polarized our country is, and then they blame the other side for polarization, right? And it's as hard as it is, it seems like there's no way we get beyond it and make progress without some kind of dialogue. Yeah. Okay, we have a lot of questions here. We'll try to do a little lightning round if that sounds okay.
Great.
And I should say thank you. Many of you influenced the questions that I've already asked because I got these in advance. Okay, this is from Greg. I'm agnostic and drawn to secular humanistic Judaism because it's godless. But I know one of the criticisms is that it's godless. What is your take on SHJ? And I will broaden it out a little bit, right? What is your take on the notion of kind of secular cultural Judaism without the religious aspect?
Yeah. I know a lot of really great Jews who don't believe in God. I just want to say that. And I think I don't want to make it too gross of a generalization. And I am a God person. I really have always thought that belief came very naturally to me. But I'll make this sort of the generalization that Judaism has often kind of privileged, let's say, deed over creed, right? There are not a lot of beliefs. We don't say you have to believe this about God, or you have to believe this about the afterlife, or resurrection. We also have resurrection as a belief in our tradition. We don't say you have to believe these things to be a Jew. Much of what we see in Jewish law is you have to behave this way. So when someone says to me, I don't believe in God, I said, that's okay. I just want you to behave in the world as if there is a God. Walk through the world as if there is goodness in the world, and you are beholden to something, and you feel accountable to something bigger than yourself. If you could do that, then that's fine. I mean, not just fine. I think that people have different things that they're serving. I think the thing I would worry about is if you don't believe in God, most of us then serve something. And it could become an idol, like whether or not it becomes, a kind of hyper-individualism or a, material gain or all the things that we end up serving instead of serving something higher. And so, and the last thing I would just say as a God person, when I was named Rabbi of Central Synagogue, there was some kind of article that wrote that something like, the scariest thing about her is she likes to talk about God. It's funny how Jews are a little bit allergic about talking about God in the same way as, like, I don't know, many other faiths is what I would say. But I'd like to just give the invitation. I know there's a lot of baggage around God, and if your only understanding of a Jewish God comes from the Bible, then it's going to be more limited. And if even worse, if your understanding of God only comes from a Passover Seder, and then you've got this vengeful God who hardens Pharaoh's heart and throws down a bunch of plagues on one people, and then and then washes away the Egyptians, and you're like, if that's God, I want to tell you that's not a God I believe in either. So if you have a very limited sort of pediatric view of God, of the Bible, my guess is you're going to say, yeah, I don't want anything to do with that, and I understand. But there is so much more of an expansive view of God in our Jewish tradition. Even within the Bible, there are many different ways of seeing God. There are probably 35 names for God in the Torah. Creator, rock, like we always think of like Lord, but there are so many other names. But then you get into Jewish mysticism, and you've got like Spinoza and his sort of pantheistic view of God. You've got Maimonides, who has a much more rational view of God. So if you're willing to kind of look, the reason why do I even care? I guess the reason I care and want you to explore it is I do think that recognizing that in the end of the day, that there is something bigger that's a force that connects all of us, that actually in some ways is a force for good in the world, and that you could tap into that force and that energy and have something even bigger to draw upon when you feel like you don't have enough in your tank, but you can tap into that energy of the world. I just think it makes our lives richer and deeper, and I want for people, I just know that for me, that was something I drew upon when I found it very difficult to feel like I was very alone. So I just open the idea to say God can be a lot bigger than the God of the Bible, or the way that you think of the God of the Bible.
And to add a point to that argument, I am less of a God person than you, as you well know. You say having a relationship with God in your life and believing God can make your life richer and deeper. There is, in fact, empirical social science research that shows that religious people tend to be happier and more satisfied with their life and healthier in all kinds of ways.
My son, who's like very much a STEM kind of guy, we went to the Grand Canyon for the first time when he was maybe 10 years old or 11 years old. And if you've been to the Grand Canyon, if you don't feel awe when you're at the Grand Canyon, I mean, it is like something else. And we were walking along the northern rim, I think it was, and we were in trees. So then when we finally come out of the trees, it was suddenly hit, and it was like this massive canyon, and it was like glorious, and there were so many colors, and I was like, oh my God, can you believe God's handiwork? And my son Gabriel said, I think that's called erosion, Mom. And I was like, what have I done wrong? No. To be fair, he was in awe of it, but he just was like, I'm going to give you I know how this works. Anyway.
We have a few questions about Israel.
Okay.
Which you talk about in the book. So from Laurie, you've mentioned that some non-Jewish clergy and allies in the progressive arena went radio silent after October 7th. You write about this experience in the book. What have you done with those feelings, and did you reach out to them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I've invested a lot in interfaith relationships, and actually part of what was so difficult is that right before October 7th happened, the summer before, I actually led an interfaith clergy trip of Manhattan clergy with a few rabbis, but with 10 other Christian clergy to Israel. And so to feel like some of them were among the ones who were silent in that moment was particularly painful. And I think the ones with whom I had a closer relationship, I reached out to them and I expressed my disappointment. And I'm happy to say that many of them, once I said something, they showed up in different ways, and including showing up at services to show support. In particular, one of the clergy who actually is literally geographically close to us, and we've shared services together for many, many years for the Holocaust. I think he really understood that in some ways, I don't think he intended to do harm. I think he just felt like he was being pulled in multiple directions. And I think because there were complicated feelings about Israel, somehow, I think October 7th was less complicated to be able to just condemn, but I think that just held them back. But I think what I tried to do was double down on the relationships that that mattered to me, and I think that we've been some repair, and in some ways, some of those relationships have even strengthened because of it.
Let me combine a question from Julie, Nadine, and Rachel. I love Israel and believe deeply in its right to not only exist and defend itself, but flourish. At the same time, my Jewish values call me toward peace and justice. How do you think American Jews can hold both of those commitments right now? How can we stand with Israel while staying true to our moral and spiritual values?
I would say hold on to both of those values. And I think that it should be familiar to people here living in Washington. I hope we believe in what our country can be and what it's doing, and also maybe not agree with everything that's happening out of our government. So do you just say, I give up, I'm done, I'm not going to be American, or America shouldn't exist? No, we fight with everything we have to make sure it becomes that country. And here's the thing, you're not going to be alone in that fight, not just with America. You're not alone in that fight with a bunch of Israeli Jews. The Israeli population, 80% of them before a couple weeks ago, and thank God we had our last living hostages returned last week, and please God, this is the turning point to a different chapter for the whole region. But before October 7th happened, there were weekly protests that included hundreds of thousands of people saying, this extremist right-wing government, it does not speak for me. And they were out there protesting in the streets. It was a very healthy democracy. After people got over the initial shock of October 7th, they were back in the streets and have been protesting for almost another 19, 20 months, every week against their own government. That's a sign of a healthy democracy. It also is a sign that there are a lot of Israelis who also want to see peace and a very different life. So I think that part of what we want to do is not disengage, but engage and support the people who are building the Israel that you want to see. And that is exactly what we should be doing in America too. So I think that's, for me, part of what helps me stay in it is I am in relationship with people in Israel who are doing this work, who deeply share my values and dreams for where Israel will be. And I think that helps. And if you can't make those trips to Israel, I think just getting to know some of those communities, and many of them are coming to America and trying to build relationships and bridges here too. So I would say to be more engaged, not less.
Wendy gets the last question. On the Friday after Yom Kippur, you officiated a joyful baby naming, despite an exhausting week. What energizes you as a rabbi?
What a nice question.
Good job, Wendy.
Gosh, I mean, I'm very blessed that I love people, and when I get to hear people's stories and then have the even greater privilege of being a small part of those stories, it is the greatest joy. And I've now been in my pulpit long enough, 20 years, that I'm now doing baby namings for people whose bat mitzvahs I did, and now I'm naming their babies. And to be a part of the cycle of people's lives in that way, it is, and at their most kind of technicolor moments, and sometimes those technicolor moments are super joyful, and sometimes those technicolor moments are deep grief. But even those moments are in some ways the most, feel like the greatest privilege. So I think that I'm in this for the stories and weaving these stories and helping people see the larger picture of meaning, and then how that larger picture of meaning fits into the larger epic story of our Jewish people, which is such a profound one and has been something that has helped bring meaning to my life. That's what makes me feel lucky to be a rabbi.
That's pretty great. So, This is night 2 of Angela's grand book tour. Night
3.
Night 3. I'm sorry.
I did
There was a night. There was something
a
before.
Central only the first night,
Before.
and then I had my official launch yesterday.
So night 2 last night was in New York, and Angela's moderator was Stephen Colbert.
Yeah, that was fun.
Sorry, you guys got the short end of the stick. And Angela and Stephen got up and together sang "Somewhere Over the Rainbow."
Yeah.
Now, you may have been looking hopefully at the guitar that is with us on stage tonight. I will not be joining Angela in song, but would you be willing to sing a song for us?
Oh, if you insist. Okay. David, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Oh, okay. I can just do it. Oh, yeah, for the guitar. That's great. Okay.
Can you go there?
So, I'm trying to decide what to sing. Yeah, this is great. But I think I'm going to sing this one because, first of all, it's next week's Torah portion. But also, it's kind of the opening of the book. And I won't go through the whole thing. But I do start by talking about the fact that that the call for Abraham and Sarah to become Jews is lech lecha. Or if you're a woman, it's lechi lach. And I love that because Debbie Friedman wrote this song, she put the female version first and said lechi lach. And lech lecha is what it says also in the Torah. But anyway, when that call comes for them, they are called to leave their birthplace and their homeland and everything they know. And they have to go to a land that they do not know. And God says, and you will be a blessing. And what I love about this is this, why can't they start Judaism from the comfort of their home? Why do they have to become strangers? When they cross over the river Euphrates in the Torah, that word in Hebrew, ya'avor, is where the word ivri comes from. Ivri means Hebrew. So to be a Hebrew, which comes from crossover, literally means that a Hebrew is a boundary crosser. And the fact that that is not just the origin story of the Jewish people, Abraham and Sarah, but it's actually the story of the biblical ancestors. It's our 400 years of being strangers in Egypt, and then it's another 2,000 years of diaspora Judaism where we talk about being wandering Jews. We have been crossing boundaries and being strangers wherever we are. And generally speaking, this has been something that we often think of as a hardship. But we say, do not oppress a stranger, for we know the heart of a stranger. And because we were strangers in the land of Egypt. I would argue that what our tradition has taught us is, as much as that can sometimes be very difficult, it is the source of our empathy, which is our superpower. It is the source of our creativity and our resilience and our grit. So in some ways, having the heart of a stranger and embracing what it feels like to know that has actually been what has made Jews who we are. So I thought I would end with that song, the call that helped us on our path as boundary crossers to create this amazing epic story, and for us to maybe embrace the heart of a stranger, but also to keep looking for a way to find home. Lechi lach, to a land that I will show you. Lech lecha, to a place you do not know. Lechi lach, on your journey I will bless you, and you shall be a blessing. You shall be a blessing, and you shall be a blessing. Lechi lach. I suspect you know this. Lechi lach, and I shall make your name great. And I shall make your name great. Lech lecha, and all shall praise your name. And all shall praise your name. Lechi lach, to the place that I will show. L'simchat chaim, l'simchat chaim, l'simchat chaim,
be a blessing. You shall be a blessing. And you shall be a blessing.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, please stay where you are as our guests make their way backstage. And let's hear it one more time for Rabbi Angela Buchdahl and David Leonhardt. In just a few more moments. Thanks for your patience. In the meantime, Marcia Aaron is our giveaway winner. So if you are Marcia, you can meet me right up here.